Welcome to this UC Connect talk. I am Professor Mark Menzies from the Music School, and today I am going to talk to you about a difficult subject. The first difficult subject to talk to you about is health and safety. I've been instructed to improvise a health and safety. I am only partly in jest. If there is an emergency, we will gather in the courtyard, in the quadrangle out there. That was that message. So now we have that difficult part out of the way, we can enjoy ourselves. My title for the talk is Life in Conflict, Notes and Afterthoughts from a Performer-Composer. And I want to just, before we get going, explain just a little bit about what those terms mean, in case you need some help with that. Usually when you're a musician, you choose one or the other. You're either a creative type, a composer, often hermit-like, disappearing off for long periods of time to channel the masterpieces you are convinced are in you, or you are a flashy performer that goes out to be as successful as possible and play as many concerts zipping around the globe as you can manage. The idea of combining the two in a career, at least in the late 20th and early 21st century, is considered a bit different. Actually, historically speaking, almost every creative person in particularly Western art music that you can think of both performed and created music. If they were very famous as a performer, like you might have heard of the violinist Niccolo Paganini, that was supposed to have channeled the devil in order to be able to play all these miraculous things on the violin, actually was a very serious-minded composer and wrote an enormous amount of music, not all of it designed to show off his incredible chops as a violinist. In past models, when you think of somebody like Mozart or of Beethoven, you tend to think of them as composing all these masterpieces that we are so familiar with. Say in the case of Beethoven, the Fifth Symphony. Da, 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 da. You think of that as sort of the hallmark of who he was or who he is to us. But of course, his ability to communicate in the extraordinary way he does through his compositions was completely and utterly informed by his ability as a performer. Mostly on the piano, but not exclusively. He also played the viola and the violin a little bit and tried his hand at a few wind instruments as well. Of course, once his deafness took over, that put paid to the idea of a professional career as a performing musician, though amusingly enough, he did actually attempt to conduct the premiere of his Ninth Symphony, one that gives the heebie-jeebies to any professional conductor today. It's such a difficult piece, and kind of in blissful unawareness, he stood there waving at the ensemble with the first violinist trying to actually tell the musicians where to play. The point behind that, which is so eloquently spoken by the way people described the gestures that Beethoven made, was that it mattered to him how the music came across, not just what he had written. He made it very clear that what he had put down on paper was just the beginning. There's a famous joke actually about the violin. It's told about many violinists, but why not pick the most famous 20th century violinist, or one of the most famous, Jascha Heifetz. And after one of his dazzling concerts that marked his entire career, he put his Guarneri del Gesù down in the case, and he had an admirer come up to him and say, "Mr. Heifetz, your violin is just so amazing. It just sounds so great." He put his ear next to the violin and said, "I don't know, it doesn't seem to be doing anything to me." The point being, it mattered that it was him playing it. And I think the same could be said of these masterpieces. Right now I don't have a volume of scores that are so elegantly printed that musicians mostly use. But nowadays, a lot of us use iPads. They are easily downloaded. I can have the entire oeuvre of Beethoven in this iPad and Mozart as well. It's not a problem. But there's something about this that becomes a little bit like a monument And the music, because it's so elegantly notated, because it's so inviting in its monumentalism, inevitably we start to see it as that. But certainly the example of Beethoven would suggest that that was far from the truth. It had to come alive. So this talk is about my life traversing both of those careers at the same time. And I'm going to begin the talk by coming with a conclusion first. These are the beginning of the notes. The afterthoughts will be the illustrations as we go through the talk. The conclusion that I would say about this life that I lead, this life of conflict, is that in the development of this career, I've fought many battles. I've fought battles with an identity of who I am as a creative artist. After all, I was born in New Zealand, in Hawke's Bay, and then at the age of 19 started traveling the world and never lived here until June of last year. As I was considering myself as a violinist, I had to consider, was I saying something to the world that was about New Zealand, or was I just being a generic concert violinist? And trust me, there are plenty of those. They play beautifully and they're very impressive, but who are they really talking to and what are they really saying? As a composer, I was raised in the European tradition. Maori music was not a big factor in my upbringing, I just be honest with that. And that started to trouble me as I took composing very seriously in my life. Being from Aotearoa, what did that mean? Who was I? And when you truly face that battle, and I think I'm in front of a room full of people that no doubt in your own way have faced this battle, about your own identity, your own ego, what does that mean? Who are you? What does it mean to you? What is your life cycle like? How do you contribute to the world? How do you balance family? All these things, we all go through it as humans. But I think when you pursue an art, whether it's the art in music or accounting or anything, one can be an artist in all of those pursuits of professionalism. You inevitably have to face the fact that in order to truly become yourself, you have to destroy the image of who you think you should be, or what other people think you should be, or what the country thinks you should be, or has deigned as should be. All of those things the world asks us to examine carefully. And for myself, I would say that I won that battle. I got rid of a sense of ego. I'll later illustrate that it was by losing my sense of self that I understood my originality as a composer. By disregarding conventions as a performer, I became a successful performer. But the funny thing was that I thought that those battles, which so many of my mentors told me were important to fight, I thought once I won them, it was over. That there would be this wonderful peacefulness, and that's where true art making takes place. I now realize I was completely wrong. That actually the life I live is a constant battle. I don't mean a violent, destructive battle, though sometimes that's part of it. I mean a battle that is about a constant flow of energy between different things that I do. After all, in my case, my autobiography, being a composer means respecting that very energy that I was making fun of at the beginning. The hermit, having lots of time on one's own, lots of time to consider putting something into the world that's worth it. At the same time, I've chosen to pursue being a performer, which involves moments like this, where I have to perform. This is the time, this is the moment, now go. And that's a very different energy. The battleground of that is one that constantly asks us to examine paradox. I would say that the remoteness that one feels as a composer is to start to connect with the things in the world that you treasure most. You find a way of putting it through that narrow sort of view of the world that is your manuscript paper, that is your way of writing music. Through that you express something that you treasure in the world, something that means something, something that moves you. Even if it's a mathematical equation, those can have emotions too, in terms of what they may imply, in terms of what they might exhibit of the world, what beauty they may encapsulate. As a performer, the sense of connection I have with people, for example, this afternoon I had a 3-hour workshop with the students at the School of Music here, the performance students, and that sense of connection with them is a wonderful thing, but it also sets me apart, because as a professor, as a teacher, there's a part of me that is an observer. I wouldn't call it somebody that judges. I don't particularly appreciate that part of teaching, so I do away with it. I observe. I understand what is of value. I can tell a funny story about value in things. There was a great composer in the early 20th century that is much revered now. I'm sure many of you know, Igor Stravinsky. And he had a very hard time starting out his career as a composer, for various reasons. He had a very pushy teacher. It's been suggested by some authors that he didn't have very much talent at first. I don't know about that, but anyhow, he struggled mightily. And then there came a moment where it all came together. Years later, he found a great friendship with the American composer Elliott Carter. And Carter was showing him some of his first compositions, and Stravinsky was admiring him very much, and was asking Elliott how he composed. And he said, well, I struggle. When the ideas first come out, they seem very square, and then I have to work with them a lot and sort of turn them into something interesting. I know the thing I'm thinking of is more interesting, but when it comes out, it's somehow more square, so I've got to really work at it. And Stravinsky said, I understand that, I relate to that. But when you're in that process of working through these ideas, do you throw away the ideas that you don't like? And Carter said, of course, they're terrible. Stravinsky said, don't. Don't throw anything away. Carefully catalogue it, by date or by composition or something. It might not seem that valuable to you right now, but one day that bit of music might turn out to be just the inspiration you're looking for. In other words, the stuff that flows through you, it might not be relevant for the composition you're working on or the problem at this particular juncture in the piece, but it probably has some value somewhere else. Sometimes the creative flow doesn't oblige according to the project. And he said the thing is that he had discovered over time, this catalogue, this carefully preserved archive of ideas, he learned how he thought. Not the conscious thinking, but that subconscious, semi-conscious flow of thought that is informed by everything that you experience, is nourished by the things that you value, but also has its own way, its own method, its own thoughts. And in the end, the more you are able to trace that methodology of how you think, the more you understand about yourself. But this self is not something you've created. It is something you learn to recognize. Again, it's something you learn to evaluate rather than to judge. As a performing musician, the issue of judgment is far more, shall we say, cutthroat and of the moment. At the outset of my career, I did what most people would expect you would do. I went to university, here at the University of Canterbury. This was in the 1980s. My main mentor was Maurice Till. Even though I didn't study piano with him, he was such a, dare I say, cosmically minded musician that his ability to mentor people of any instrument or voice was uncanny. And like was expected in those days, you pursued the thing that it was supposed you were best at, and that was being a violinist. Part of what you did was enter contests or pass examinations, go into other parts of your study, which I did dutifully. However, there was always a paradox of a problem that I may suggest to you that comes at any of those junctures. You have to picture any number of very talented young musicians, and I know I had some talent. I don't know if I was the best or the worst or in the middle. That's for other people to worry about. But you know that you have something to say, and you recognize that audiences appreciate if you communicate something that you want to say. And you stand in front of people that are equipped to evaluate your playing, and you play, and you don't make a mess of it. You play very well, you play very professionally, and afterwards they say, you did it. But by the way, I disagreed with the way you played this part, and I disagreed with the way that you interpreted that, and I disagreed with the tone that you produced on that note, and I disagreed with this, and I would have rather it be this, and I much prefer this other performer and all of this. What I suggest to you is that the adjudicators have said much more about themselves than about the performance that they listen to. And I go on further to suggest to you that my going through those experiences, and I confess right now, I never won a single one of them. And I know for certain that that was the best gift the world could have ever given me. And the reason for that is just simply that when something doesn't work out for you artistically, yet you, as I said, really wish to say something, there is an avenue to express that. I know it sounds like a cheap generality to tell you, but it's one I confront every day as a teacher. Because as a teacher, I have to say to my students, you do have a future. And if I'm supporting you, and if I'm going to give you, or I'm going to be part of a mechanism that gives you a degree, I am supporting you. I'm saying that there is a future for you. If I thought otherwise, I would be a very corrupted person indeed. So I have to believe with every ounce that when people present themselves as students with an energy that is not going to necessarily conform to the expectation of adjudicators, that there is going to be a life for them all the same, that they have something to say. A turning point for me in that way came at several points in my playing career. As a composer, I resisted having a professional life for a long time. I had too many friends who were composers, and I didn't want to take their opportunities away from them. So I kept it very hidden. I wrote music only for my friends, with the strict understanding that they weren't to take opportunities away from my other friends who were composers. So I focused for the first 20 years of my career or so on being a performer. And one of the breakthrough moments for me was meeting living composers. As I told you at the beginning, my outset as a musician were playing, well, as it's commonly called, old dead white guys music. And when I finally met not dead at all, and sometimes not guys either, there were plenty of wonderful women composers as well, that really brought the idea that I was around people that were wanting to know what music could become rather than what it should be. And I began to recognize that composers of the past may have felt the same. That our Beethoven or our Mozart wrote a score a bit like the law. If you think of the law, there are two sides to it. There's the side that says there is the letter of it, thou shalt not do this, or it has to go like that. But there's always a spirit behind it, a spirit of intention, an idea of how this law is going to contribute to society. That is the same with music. There is a form that comes out, the notes, the manner of it, but what it says, the context of it, how it speaks to you, is also crucial. That bit I sung earlier about Beethoven, da 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 da, that's something that is trying to alert you to something. In fact, it's meant to shock you a little bit. So nowadays, people think it would be perfect if we replicated exactly the sound that Beethoven might have heard, should he have had his hearing and with the instruments of his day and the way the horns worked and everything, because they were different, yeah? Maybe. But the fact is, some dramatic performance, dare I say even with a rock and roll track or anything like that, that still tries to evoke that spirit of shocking people, of alerting them to this is meant to be something different. It's meant to be dramatic, it's meant to kind of storm at you rather than just kind of placate you. That also has to be respected in how one interprets the music. That frequently leads to conflict with those that decide they are the arbiter of taste rather than the appreciator of it. As my life went on, I realized that I faced a conflict, a battle, with this idea to connect with living composers and being a concert violinist. Most concert presenters decided that the audiences didn't like contemporary music. That was because, quite naturally, in the 1980s and 90s, and the music from the generation before, was quite intellectually funded and derived. It was part of the politics of the Cold War, and at some point I can get into it separately. We don't need to go into it now. But there was quite a uniform decision to make music in a particular way, and it didn't respond well to most audiences. Most audiences didn't respond well to it, rather, I should say. And it was a bit of a problem. But even by the time that I was starting to perform this music in the 1990s, the audiences had changed beyond recognition. And in fact, when people dared to play new music, however new it was, however unfamiliar, and you made the case for it, you didn't apologize for it, audiences lapped it up across the globe. In my beginnings in England, in the United States, and certainly in New Zealand and Australia, Japan, Brazil, I could go on and on. It matters how you present it, not just the music. But I fought that notion of the conventional career until one wonderful lesson I had with one of my great teachers, Franco Gulli, an Italian who lived most of his life in the United States. And he said to me, "Mark, I feel that when you come to each of our lessons that I should be paying you rather than the other way around, because you always show me this new music." And he was such a great observer of how I played, so it didn't matter if it was unfamiliar to him, he always had a lot to suggest to me. And he said, "It is wonderful that you engage with that music in this way, but my one word of advice is never be a specialist. Keep informing and nourishing a sense of who you are as a musician with who you are as a musician. Don't cut off a part of it. Find a way to cycle back through all the repertoire that you enjoy and that you appreciate." And that's advice I always took. But it led to a little bit of a battlefield. It led to this wonderful thing where, with concert presenters, and indeed with my audiences, I negotiated. I said, "I give you some of what you are familiar with, some of what you might enjoy, and I'm going to see if I can't take you on the magic carpet ride and have you see lands you have not seen before, and you might enjoy them. You might enjoy the smell, you might enjoy the noises that are there. And if I fail, well, then you can come talk to me afterwards." But inevitably, again, with this proactive approach, often people respond very, very beautifully. I want to have a small digression, because I made the whole talk about conflict, and I wanted to talk about the idea that not all conflict is, shall we say, a bad thing, that in fact performing on a musical instrument is an encapsulation of the paradox that is the notion of conflict, happy conflict. Take, for example, the violin, which I currently have under my chin. The thing that activates the sound is a bow that has horsehair on it and the little hooks that actually make the sound once it's greased up with a little rosin from a tree. The thing about the bow is that it is the most obnoxious vehicle to make a pure, even, sustained sound, even though that's what stringed instruments are famous for. In other words, if any of you have tried to pick up a violin, assuming you don't already play a string instrument and you've learned it, the thing the bow wants to do above all is bounce. So the easiest thing for it to do is to bounce. The reason why is because it's curved in this way and the wood is chosen in such a way as to be very flexible and very bouncing, so that it can do that. At the same time, in order to produce just one note that goes, it actually takes an unbelievable amount of miniature muscular control at every point in the balance of that single bow stroke in order to do that. So actually the hardest thing to do for a young or beginning player is to play that. the easiest thing is to bounce it, even though often it's presented as that is the most virtuosic of using of the violin. That conflict of gravity and means over intention is the thing that makes you love playing the violin the most. At times it makes you loathe it as well, but that's another matter. For example, and it is a physical reality, that sometimes when you get excited or nervous or anxious or whatever, naturally you may have all noticed that your body may tremble a little. Well, there's nothing like having the fingers just tremble a little and try to produce a soft, long note like that. It's really a very unpleasant feeling altogether. In other words, that soft, beautiful note may actually be the most tense thing, the most painful thing you'll do in any performance. Strangely enough, it turns out playing would seem like it takes a lot of effort. It's the easiest thing in the world. It's just gravity. You just let the arm fall, and the violin, if it's a good one, it kind of responds in that way. So paradox and conflict in that way is an essential part of the notion of being a performing artist. As an interpreter, I've touched on this little idea of the spirit of intention behind a piece as opposed to the letter of its law. And I want to refer to a very famous piece of classical music. In fact, it is, according to the Book of Records, the most famous piece of classical music, The Four Seasons by Vivaldi. What you may not realize is that that's part of a series of 12 concertos called The Contest Between Harmony and Invention. And it was essentially a collection that you might call even a musical dissertation on conflict. The idea where there is this contest between harmony, how exciting you can be just in pure harmony, and invention, with the implication that the invention may destroy the harmony at some point, or certainly transform it in radical ways. In the midst of my career building in the 1990s, I was invited by the Auckland Philharmonia Orchestra to play these Four Seasons for the first time in my life. I was not only going to play the solo part for all four concertos in one go, I was also conducting the orchestra. It was near the beginning of my career. It was a slightly intimidating task. A lot of these colleagues in that orchestra are more experienced, are very opinionated, wonderful musicians in their own way. And now I was to take control of this. But being the sort of musician that I am, I wanted to resist the idea of just following the conventions of how the piece is performed. And if you excuse me generalizing, generally the pieces are played very pretty and very, shall we say, harmoniously. The emphasis of the interpretation is on the harmony, perhaps less on the invention. And as I sat studying these pieces, as I always do when I interpret music of other people, I have to figure out, at least in my own mind, is why did the composer bother to write this? And in the case of the Four Seasons, that actually is quite a journey of thought. After all, if he was merely being ornamental, one could say that they are like little pretty pictures of the seasons, and they just kind of sit there and the music sort of goes along. But that's not the way I've ever experienced them, even with the most pretty performance. I've thought, well, perhaps those pieces are something different. Then I thought maybe he was attempting to write the way he normally wrote music, and he just put a fancy title on it and said, this will sell better. But I couldn't buy that because unfortunately I knew at least a small proportion of the 800 other concertos that he had written, so they didn't fit in the same mold. He was clearly trying something different. So why did he write it? And I have to say I was stumped for a while, until it suddenly dawned on me. With the exception of one of the movements out of all 12 movements that are the Four Seasons, each of them focus on suffering, or pain, or crisis. Everything from the slow movement to Summer, which is all about the poor tortured soul in the middle of the torpor of the heat, where mosquitoes are biting. And the players are asked to play this kind of dotted, irritating rhythm, which they then descend into distant thunder. Meanwhile, the persona that is being bitten by these mosquitoes is trying to play this peaceful melody, but is clearly being disturbed every time by the thunder and by the mosquitoes. Or, in Autumn, the last movement of Autumn, which has this beautiful scene of the hunt, a very banal subject actually for the Baroque period, all very regal, all very normal, nothing particularly alarming, until the violin solo starts up. And it descends into a portrait of the wounded animal. It's not a portrait of the hunter. It's not of the success. It's of the suffering of the animal. And in fact, the unaccompanied solo at the end, with the last thing the violin plays, is heartbreaking. And the musical invention is basically taking the tonal system that Vivaldi composed at the end of the Baroque era and breaks it in half, as if in his grief at this empathy for this animal, he just said, ah! So when I realized this, I thought, well, that means when he wrote all the poetry over the music, he's asking you to decide this contest between harmony and invention. You as a performer, how do you invent that picture of the wounded animal, or of the irritated person in the summer heat, or any of the other situations that the concertos explore? And it became pretty obvious that it was through the tone of the instrument, that playing it all in the sort of normal way was not going to communicate what the music was about. In other words, when somebody cries out in pain, you don't cry out in a beautiful operatic sotto voce. Ah. If you're really in pain, you tend to go, ah! And it tends to glissando, it tends to go like that. To cut the long story short, I decided to perform it in this way, and I persuaded the orchestra to follow me, and with the hierarchical nature of orchestras being the nature that they are, though some of them really didn't appreciate doing it the way I wanted, they obligingly followed my lead. The newspaper reviews were scathing. It's the first time I got a rotten review in the newspapers. And it was very funny, because up till then I'd had a few concerts reviewed in the newspapers in various parts of the world, and I was excitedly open them, and it's part of the life cycle of this thing. And when I opened this and I saw it was merciless actually. All the sort of effects I was doing on the instrument to make the sound not so pure, or to really express this in an expressionistic way, the critics sort of thought I had lost control of the instrument, as if though there was some problem with my ability to play it. Fair enough, he's entitled to that opinion if he thinks that. But reading it as an artist, and as not feeling that I'd done it because I'd lost control, because I intended to, there was this tremendous relief. There was this sense that, no, I believed in this interpretation. And the fact that somebody disagreed with you, you know what that was so much better than was, oh, that was lovely. Because in the end, the art is not about, it was just lovely. It was saying something. And some loved it, some hated it, some in the orchestra, it was almost like a civil war, because we took it on tour, and a few members of the orchestra, gave me a piece of their mind as it went. And that was also wonderful. It was a part of the dialogue, which rarely happens, as I said, in these hierarchical environments. But it was very freeing of the notion that I had to be one kind of musician or another. I mentioned that as a composer, I decided to resist really coming out into the world and presenting myself in a professional sense for a long time. This was partly because, as I was saying, I didn't want to intrude upon the opportunities of my friends, who I treasured very much and still do. But actually there was another reason, and that was that I suffered from this capacity, which was very helpful as a violinist and as a pianist and all those other things. I learned very quickly. I learned all the ways to do things. I learned how to do it. I had a, shall we say, a gift for it. And I had the same for composing. I could pick up the tricks very quickly. But none of them meant anything to me. And that was a really big problem. And every now and then a piece would come out that I'd say, no, that's it. But I had no reason, I didn't know why. And I thought for a long time that it was a question of just becoming better at the tricks. And it was not until I was finishing my doctorate that I took which was not in composition, but I took an orchestration class with the very esteemed Japanese composer Joji Wassa. And what he called orchestration was actually a description of how he composed. It turned out, like many composers over periods of time, he saw music in very visual terms. A composition came to him as a shape, like a drawing, often very detailed. And when he wrote the music that was evoked by this drawing, it was a kind of transcription or orchestration of these shapes, these extraordinary geometric notions or free form or whatever. It was all kinds of things. He was fascinated, for example, by infrared photography. So he would take some of his imagery and put that through that and then find ways for the instruments to communicate this sense. And something in me about the way he presented it, it was partly an authenticity that he exhibited. He had lived in the States for many years, yet his English was appalling. So the lectures were, there's no disrespect to him, he just simply was a slow speaker. It was painful to make sentences come out. He had to think a lot. It was not yet fluent for him, probably never will be. But precisely because it was communicated in that way, there was a sense that everything he spoke had absolute meaning. And as time went on, we connected that meaning. Furthermore, he did things as a lecturer I have never experienced to such a degree in lectures. If something moved him, he simply burst into tears in the lecture. A memory of meeting a famous composer, not because they were famous, but because of the way they touched him. There was a complete naked honesty about who he was. And it caused me to think, well, who am I? And where did I come from? Well, you can think of that as much as you like, but that's not going to turn you into a composer. What actually happened to me was the last of my stories, the last of the afterthoughts, as it were. I don't know if many of you know the process of how recordings are made, but one of the most crucial components to making an audio recording of musicians playing is the producer. In Western classical music that's notated, the producer is someone that sits in the booth with the scores, has to know the scores inside and out, and is essentially adjudicating what's going on in the studio. The musicians that are there rarely have the ability to really hear what they're doing because you're in the middle of doing it. There's a certain amount you can, but the way microphones pick it up and the proportions in the studio and everything, it makes it complicated. So the producer are your ears. They're your guide. Later you'll go help edit it and so on, and you'll make your own minds up as musicians. But after all, if there's a whole passage where there was a small mistake in it and nobody noticed, because in the heat of the moment they didn't notice, and then later, as the producer, you didn't notice that, and on that recording is the mistake, you're in for trouble. So you take that job very seriously. It's very strenuous. You have to have total concentration all the time. And part of your job is taking notes of how each take went, or each segment of the music that you're recording. And I was invited to do this job for an esteemed ensemble in Southern California, the California Air Unit. And it was music by a contemporary American composer called Mel Powell, who writes in this incredibly elegant gestural style. It's very distinct, the way he does it. He was a jazz musician early in his life, prodigious pianist, played with Benny Goodman and all those types. Then wrote very, shall we say, avant-garde intellectual music, but always informed with this love of gesture that he got from playing jazz. So his contemporary music was just delicious to listen to and to play. And I had this project to complete after this job was over, this composition project, this kind of commission. And after 3.5 days of being saturated in Mel Powell's music. I then cleared a day out of my life, and I just kind of let it all go, and then sat down the next day to begin this commission. But all I could think of was Mel Powell. It had completely, as it were, I needed an exorcism or something. It had taken over my soul. And there was a moment of panic. It's like, how can I be so subsumed by somebody else's music? How can I write something original when I'm thinking in somebody else's terms? And something just went off in my mind. Don't resist it. Go with it. Don't write the piece you thought you were going to write. Go with this opportunity. And what I decided to do instead of this other idea was to take my memory of the music that I had been studying, not the score, but the memory, and transcribe it in a creative way. In other words, to play a game with the music, as it were. And it was the only thing I could think to do to get out of this moment of panic. And as my pen came down to the paper, for the first time in my life, I realized who I was. Being so close to not being original revealed to me what my choices would be, even within a restricted language of somebody else's choosing. And when I finished the piece, a few days later, I realized that Mel Powell could never have written that piece. And even though many of my friends recognized the tribute to Mel Powell's style, they also commented, and I don't mean this in any vainglorious way, they commented on how much it revealed of who I was in the contrast to what it was that we had written before. So, in sum total, to conclude today and to open the floor for any questions you may have, I present to you a life in conflict, but one that, even if I were to say these different energies are sometimes difficult to manage, one finds a way. In fact, it was probably one of the greatest contemporary performer-composers, Leonard Bernstein, who once said, "Oh, it's so easy to be a conductor, a pianist, a composer, a TV presenter, a teacher, all at the same time. The only thing is never try to do them all at the same time." And that's a piece of advice I also followed. So they're not always simultaneous. Thank you very much. Any questions? Oh dear.
I've got a question. In terms of the conflict between composition and being a performer, how do you cope with this? Do you say, right, for the next fortnight I'm going to concentrate on performing, then I put that all away and then I become a composer? How do you sort of organise your time?
How do I organise my time? That's a wonderful question. I tried that. And actually that would be technically the advice of Bernstein, which is kind of how he did run his life, I understand. It didn't work for me, for the simple reason that I seemed to always find myself busy with things to do. And I came to embrace a part of my personality which is never really that stationary. I get kind of creeped out by lots of silence around me and long times in isolated places. I like being around people and so on. So the composition side, I deal with these endless amounts of notebooks. I take it wherever I go. Ideas come. Earlier today I flew down from Wellington. I sometimes fall asleep in planes. I fly a lot, so I'm used to falling asleep in them. I've learned how to do that. It's very helpful. But sometimes something about that moment, being stuck in one place, having to sit down, there being nothing else to entertain, with all tribute to Kiora, the New Zealand magazine, it's not that interesting. And an idea always is bubbling to come up. And sometimes it's just kind of looking at it and suddenly there is one notion. To be honest with you, the life cycle of composing does mean, because I don't write with computer notation, I always write by hand. It's a thing I do. I have lots of interesting pens and pencils and whiteout and rulers and non-rulers and all this, and special paper and all of this. And I enjoy the tactile, shall we say, even graphic notion of how the music looks. I believe that can shape how you perform it. So the time that I have to finish a piece, after all the sketches are done, after all the notebooks are brought together and there's the initial sketch and then maybe another one, the copying out of it that's where I have to reserve a few days. And that becomes I think that's good for one's health. It brings the heart rate down. You start to notice a very interesting kind of mental state. The mental state there I find akin to performing. When you perform, believe it or not, the conscious mind is one of the worst parts of the control mechanism of playing. Actually, it's the semi-conscious mind that you kind of adjudicate and manage with your conscious mind. That's the best way to be. I always make this joke with my students that I have no idea how to play the violin. And they all laugh. But actually I don't, at least with my conscious mind. And I can prove that by simply reversing my limbs. I've learned to play the violin, should we say, the normal way. If I try to do it in reverse, I can't play. I can't, I'm not joking. For all my abilities as a musician, need I say more or play more? Why is it that I can then play with control this way around? Not because of anything that my conscious mind is really doing at that moment. All it's doing is sort of adjudicating a kind of cloud, a multitude of tasks that then sort of all float to the surface in the right order, nourished by the way I practice, the thinking before the performance, by so many things. And I would say that's the same in that composition moment too, where all the preparation has gone into it. In that copying process, there will be all sorts of decisions made, but they're ones that the conscious mind just adjudicates more than fights with. Yes?
Just the absolute opposite question to the one that you just asked. Have you had a moment where you have found those two personalities thoroughly integrated? Or have you moments?
That is a wonderful question. I would say that for me, perhaps I didn't say it clearly enough. In fact, I know I didn't. The battle to me is in the preparation. The moment of the doing is the acceptance of the coexistence of these energies. One of the ways one can perform is as an improviser. If one is playing non-Western music, often improvisation is a key element to the performance. But even in Western music, there are ornamental details, or there is this practice called improvisation. If you're a jazz musician, there's a form of improvisation. One of the terminologies for that is composing in the moment. And we're all capable of it in a creative way. In fact, I would say that any creative act is in the moment, though there might be aspects of it that are prepared or pondered over long periods of time and allowed to mature and practiced and all of those things. But even as a practicing musician, I actually think of this wonderful statement. This author, you may know, Quentin Crisp, of the Naked Civil Servant fame. And there's a story in that, I believe in that book, where he was attempting to enter immigration in the United States many decades ago. And one of the questions that they were obliged to ask you in those days, I believe it's the 1950s, 1940s, 30s, I forget, are you a practicing homosexual? To which Quentin Crisp, without thinking, replied, practicing? I don't need any practice, I'm perfect! and I mean, it's a bit exaggerated to say that's an attitude to practicing a musical instrument, but to a certain extent, what I was saying earlier about the temptation to judge things and reject things is perhaps not helpful even to the basic technique of playing a musical instrument, let alone the basic notion of playing an improvisation or making a composition. An illustration of that is, let's say I am practicing a piece that requires me to make a leap up the instrument, which can be perilous. I have to go from this note to an octave higher, like that. Now, it's possible when I'm practicing that, because of its relative difficulty, I might miss it. And what you'll often find people do is, I'm practicing. I must suffer. Oh, I got it right now. The fact is that this note, that one, is also a task we may be faced with. It's a part of our technique as a player. To go to the octave, it's also something you may desire, but you may need to go further. And all of these movements are under a general one that I know how to do. It's a shift, and there's a certain motion that goes with it. The precision of it is something in my semi-conscious mind. It's not in my conscious mind. There's no way that ever will be conscious. It's too finicky. It's a feeling, and you find a way to become more and more nuanced in that feeling. The thing is that if, in the process of making the mistake, you do not see that as a performance unto itself, as a perfection unto itself, you've lost an opportunity to understand all of those motions. And in the end, you need them all. In performing, to answer the question more pertinently, perhaps, as humans, we all make mistakes in every performance. It's just a given. Little miscalculations, tiny little things come into it, blah, 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 blah. When you find this flow, where everything that goes right, everything that goes not exactly as you may have intended, that take you on a path you hadn't expected, if you see each of those as an opportunity of expression, each of those as an opportunity to get closer to the music, not further, closer to your expression of it, then you become a consummate performer. Then the flow goes on. Even when disasters happen, like equipment failure or something, it happens to me all the time. My first concert in Carnegie Hall, one of my strings broke. And it was one of those situations where the concert was almost over, and it wasn't worth starting again and restringing it up and everything. I just had to find a solution in the moment. It was not the ideal solution. But the point is, it was a very exciting piece, and the audience loved that thing. Will he survive? Because they saw the broken string. You know, there was this sport to it suddenly, this blood sport, you know. And, you know, you feed off that as a musician. And the imprecisions that might have come about in that particular piece are not something I would intend to do, but those imprecisions were part of the ability to make the piece speak. And as such, for that moment, I treasured them because they were what enabled me to say the piece. I wouldn't have it any other way.
Why don't you play us something?
You'd like me to play something? With pleasure. I'm going to play on the viola, one of my own compositions. You may have heard it before if you've shown up to a concert recently, but you wouldn't have heard it this close. And with the new bits I added. It was actually written for the first concert I gave connected with the university here a year ago. It's called The Song of the Birds. It's a creative transcription of a piece by Pablo Casals, one of the musicians I often like to think of as, in his advocacy for world peace, and particularly against the travails of his tragic country, in Spain at the time, he was a fighter. He actually fought playing the cello. He was a short guy with very short fingers, bless you. And he had terrible troubles playing the instrument. It's a rather unforgiving physical thing to do when you have small hands. And he used to always say that fight, that physical, visceral fight he had with the instrument, is what made him the expressive musician that he was. This song of the birds that he transcribed is a folk song, a Catalonian folk song. The basic premise being that all the birds have gathered around Jesus' crib and they're paying tribute to him, the infant. He liked to say that when the birds flew into the air, they were saying, peace, peace, peace. So my piece, please, when I did the transcription for this request, I really didn't start out with this, but I've written a number of pieces around New Zealand birds, sometimes very, portraying exactly the sounds of tui or fantails or whatever. And these sounds suddenly made their way into the piece. So my idea was that we have this prelude to the song, this ancient Catalonian folk song that is so beautifully transcribed by Casals. The prelude starts, but immediately there's a few birds from Aotearoa around this crib as well, making their little say as well. And then it sort of drifts back into the song, just as a kind of resting place of the emotion, and then off we go again. Well, unless there are any more questions, thank you very much for a wonderful evening.
Thank you.